Chapter 28 Wildwood Rising. A steady breeze picked up the tattered scraps of fallen leaves on the dirt paving the long road and shuffled them around in little funnels. The trees were changing more and more each day. Another autumn was reaching its height. Soon winter would arrive with its steady gloom of rain and the occasional fall of snow. The people of Southwood were busy stocking their larders with the jarred supplies of the summer's harvest, and eyeing their steep wood piles while their begrudging offsprings stacked it in tidy blocks in dry enclosures, away from their house walls where the bugs could get in. The two guards stood on either side of the wide wooden gate, leaning on their rifles. They'd been on shift for more than 5 hours and were already looking forward to their reprieve for the evening. The sun was shifting downward in the sky. An early twilight was at hand. They could smell the first whiffs of the nearby house's dinners being put on the hob, and it made their stomachs growl. In unison, in fact. Hearing it, they looked at each other and gave a laugh. A noise sounded from the distance. A clattering noise. Something was coming toward them on the long road. They stiffened. The evening's rush hour had long passed, and the road's travelers had been fairly sparse, as they always did this time of the evening. Once the final shipments had made their way into the Southwood gates, the long road often had the feel of a deserted highway. The clattering grew closer. The guards exchanged a glance and stood up from their leaning positions, both of them staring down the wide expanse of road. The noise was distinctly metallic, like a chain being rattled, or a bicycle. It came around a distant bend, weaving under the weight of its passengers. On the front handlebars sat a young boy with a fountain of curly black hair atop his head. He was wearing a dirty, torn military uniform. As the bike came closer, the guards saw that the person pedaling the bike was a young girl with short, dark hair. A small red wagon bounced along behind the bike, carrying a bald infant swaddled in a pile of blankets. The bike came to a quick, skidding stop in front of the gates, and the boy on the handlebars hopped off. He pulled a sling from his pocket and began swinging it casually at his side. The girl dismounted from the seat and, after quickly checking on the baby in the wagon, turned to the two guards. "Let us through," she said. The guard on the left of the gate laughed, taking in the strange sight. "Oh yeah?" he said. "What's your business?" "We've come to free Owl Rex and the citizens of the Avian Principality from the Southwood prison," she said matter-of-factly. "Oh, and to remove Lars Svick and his cronies from power." She thought for a moment before adding, "Peacefully, if at all possible." The guards stared, speechless. The boy with the sling prompted, "Well, you gonna open up?" The guard on the right tried to snap himself from his confusion. You've got to be... no! What are you talking about?" "This is a coup," said the girl. "So if you wouldn't mind opening those gates, we'd greatly appreciate it." The guard continued to sputter. "Come on now, little one. You and what army?" The girl smiled. "This one," she said. From behind them, around the distant bend of the long road, the horizon was suddenly filled with a multitude of birds, humans, and animals, a wall of figures moving towards the great gate. It would be called the bicycle coup when, in due time, the history was written. It would be recorded as a perfectly peaceful overthrow, the existing Southwood army having already been at odds with the ever-expanding force of the Sword, the government's nefarious secret police. As the combined force of the Avian infantry and the so-called Wildwood irregulars marched through the streets of Southwood, they were met with open arms, the citizens and soldiers falling into step with them on the march toward Piddock Mansion. When they'd finally arrived at the doors of the mansion, the major players of the Svick administration had either escaped, running into the surrounding woods to presumably find refuge in some damp gully, or were kneeling in supplication on the marble floor of the mansion foyer. There, the arriving revolutionaries issued their first demand, the keys to the Southwood prison. The overthrown officials handed them over with no resistance. The revolutionaries then boarded the steam train that ran to the prison, a welcome respite since they'd spent the better part of the last 12 hours on a grueling march through half the country. When they'd arrived at the walls of the prison, the gates were thrown open, and a pinwheeling collage of plumage erupted from within, funneling into the sky. The imprisoned birds of the avian principality were freed. The last bird to exit the prison, it is recorded, was a very large owl, the crown prince of the avians, and he was met with embraces from the lead revolutionaries. Together, they decamped back to Pittock Mansion and set about mapping out a new era for the wood. "Hold still," instructed Prue, her colored pencil posed over the page of her sketchbook. Enver cocked an eye sideways and looked at her. "How much longer?" He managed through a half-open beak. He shifted his small talons on the railing of the balcony, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Almost done," replied Prue, lowering the tip of the pencil and drawing a rust-colored streak. The wisp of the bird's tail feather was complete. "There," she said. She placed the pencil on the stone of the railing and held her sketchbook at a distance, so the grainy details of the colored pencil blurred together to form the striped features of the sparrow. Enver, freed from his frozen position, hopped over to take a look. "Very nice," he said. Prue wrote his name in capitals under the picture. Below that, she wrote the words Melospizia Melodia in her best script. "Song sparrow," explained Prue. Enver chirped appreciatively. "I mean, it's not improving on Mr. Sibley or anything," Prue demurred. "And he didn't even have the benefit of being able to talk to his subjects, but it'll do." Enver, antsy to move, leapt into the air and wheeled above the twin turrets of Pittock Mansion. Prue watched him sail against the charcoal gray sky. A skyline of dense trees defined the horizon below the sparrow's dizzying flight path, golden yellow maples and deep green firs. Beyond the shroud of trees, she knew, was Portland, her home. From this vantage, Prue thought, Portland seemed like the strange, magical country, not the world she currently stood in, with its stately groves of tall trees and busy populace, plying their trades in a peaceful coexistence with the world around them. The lattice of Portland's freeways, clogged with cars and trucks, all the concrete and metal, these things seemed more alien to her now. She shook herself from her thoughts. A long day's ride was ahead of her. She closed her sketchbook and collected the colored pencils, slipping them back into her messenger bag. The air was cool. Fall had truly arrived. The smell was everywhere. A door opened behind her, and she turned to see Owl Rex and Brendan, deep in discussion, approach through the wide French doors from the second-story sitting room. Brendan's arm was affixed to his chest in a tight sling, but he seemed to be moving about without much trouble. There had been quite a to-do the day before, when the mansion nurses had insisted on his having a bath. The hallways had echoed with his roaring objections. His clothes having been laundered and his skin freshly scrubbed, he was barely recognizable as the rake she'd met in the woods. "How's it going in there?" she asked as the two walked to the railing of the balcony.
"There is little doubt that it will be a long, difficult process," said the owl. "So many species were given short shrift by that thick rule of law. Much recompense is due. The coyote dignitaries are expected today. Their inclusion will no doubt be controversial. Already the bandits and the Northwood farmers are at odds. A few of my bird underlings staged a walkout over compensation to the families of the imprisoned avians. Thankfully, lunch arrived early, and they were coerced back to the table with the promise of fresh pine nuts." He sighed. "One thing is certain, however, a striking feeling in the... No process of government building is ever easy. There is, however, a striking feeling in the air, regardless of the petty disputes, that we will arrive at a solution in time. A solution that will see to the rights and needs of all citizens of the wood."
Brendan massaged the bandages at his shoulder.
It's no easy thing," he said, his feet shifting against the brick of the balcony. "But the sooner we get to some sort of agreement, the better. All the paving stones around here hurt my feet. I'm antsy to get back to the wood, back to the hideout and my people."
"I'm sure it'll all work out," said Prue. "You're all pretty able folk."
"There'd be a place for you, you know," said the owl, arching an eyebrow. "And ambassadorship, perhaps? Envoy to the mystics. How does that title suit you?"
"Thanks, Owl," she said, "but I really have to get back. My parents, I bet they're tearing their hair out, wondering what's happened. Mac needs to go home. I need to go home. The owl nodded in understanding.
Well, as you know, you'll be welcome back any time. Where's the little barn now? Asked Brendan. Your brother, I mean.
As if conjured by the reference, Penny the maid appeared at the open French doors, crouched over to hold the upstretched hand of Mac, helping him toddle over to the threshold on the balcony. He'll be a walker in no time, proclaimed Penny, beaming. He's really getting the hang of it. Prue walked to meet them. She hoisted Mac up in her arms. Thanks for watching him, Penny, she said. It just needed a little moment to get ready. The maid curtsied. I guess you'll be leaving then. It was an honor to have met you, Miss McKeel. You too, Penny. Thanks for your help. The maid turned to go, but let out a little shriek when a figure came bowling out of the sitting room, through the doorway, nearly knocking her over. Curtis! Shouted Prue. Watch where you're going. Curtis, neatly decked out in a freshly pressed uniform, made a clumsy bow to the maid. Sorry about that, he said, before returning to his mission. Owl, Brendan, there you both are, exclaimed Curtis. He came rushing to the railing of the balcony. You should really go back in there. Hi, Prue. It's kind of a mess. The birds are in the chandelier, and they're refusing to come down till the Southwood contingent agrees to dismantle all the checkpoints, and the Northwooders are still arguing with the bandits on amnesty for poppy beer shipments, while the bandits have rejected, and Sterling's brandishing his pruning shears, saying he'll clip the trouser buttons off any bandit who disagrees. Ugly, ugly words, said Septimus, clucking his tongue. He was perched on Curtis's shoulder, gnawing on a medal he'd been awarded for bravery. The silver surface was covered in little teeth marks. The owl and the bandit king exchanged a vexed look, and the two of them turned to go. Goodbye, Prue, said the owl, shaking his head. Maybe you're better off on the outside. Brendan held out his arms and gave Prue and Mac a long embrace. Till we meet again, outsider, he said, stepping back. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small, shiny piece of metal, dimpled from being hammered flat. He pressed it into her palm. If ever you find yourself in the wood, he said, and you're waylaid by bandits, show 'em this. Prue turned it over in her fingers. On the back had been etched the words, Get out of highway robbery free, by decree of the Bandit King. Brendan winked and turned to leave. Curtis started to follow the two of them back into the mansion, but the owl stopped him. Stay here, he said. We'll handle things in there. Your friend is leaving. You might want a moment with her before she goes. He gestured to Septimus. Come, rat, he said. You never know when a rodent's perspective will be needed. Leave those two alone a moment. Septimus, easily flattered, leapt from Curtis's shoulder to the ground. Bye, Prue, he said. She bowed slightly and watched as the rat scampered into the mansion. The owl and the bandit followed, disappearing behind the French doors. Curtis looked at Prue, his face falling. Really? He asked. That soon? Yeah, she said. I've got to get Mac back. To be honest, I've been missing my bed, my friends. I'm even missing my parents, if you can believe it. It'll be nice to be back home. A wind picked up and coursed through the manicured estate of the mansion, sending a fountain of leaves whirling about the tidy gardens below. You sure you don't want to come with me? Prue asked. Curtis nodded. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do here. A whole government to rebuild. Since I spent that time with the Coyote Army, they're saying I might be a lot of help when the Coyote ambassadors arrive. He paused and looked out over the horizon of trees. Plus, I made an oath, Prue. I'm a bandit now. A real Wildwood bandit. I just can't go back on that. That moment on the long road before you came up, I had the chance to leave. But I'm needed here, Prue. I belong here. A silence fell over the two friends. The baby in Prue's arms filled the quiet with a string of babbling gurgles. Prue watched her friend Curtis, wondering if she looked as changed as he did. Okay, said Prue finally. I understand. She squinted up at the sky, the thin gray of the clouds beginning to glow as the morning sun continued its upward arc. Walk me to my bike? She asked. Of course, said Curtis. They made their way through the long, looming hall of the mansion, down the wide curve of the grand staircase above the foyer, and out through the front door of the grounds. They walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Leaning against the stone of the mansion's veranda was Prue's bike, and Curtis helped her make a long bed of blankets in the wagon for Mac to ride in. A carved wooden horse, given to Mac as a gift, lay where they'd left it on the floor of the red wagon, and Mac was overjoyed to be reunited with the toy. "Come on," said Curtis. "I'll walk you as far as the start of the long road." "So, what are you going to do now?" asked Prue as they made their way lazily along the serpentine drive of the mansion. "I don't know," he said. "Once this is through, though, I guess the rest of us bandits, those who haven't already returned, will head back to camp. There's a lot of work to do. We lost a bunch in the war. Gonna have to get used to sleeping under the stars, that's for sure." "I'm sure you'll do fine," said Prue. Standing in the middle of the driveway, just beyond the turnout in front of the mansion doors, was a single brilliantly colored caravan wagon. A white rabbit was lying on his back underneath the axle of the wagon's front wheel, hammering at the assembly with a crescent wrench. A woman in a sackcloth robe stood over him, muttering instructions. "Iphigenia!" Prue shouted as they came close. The woman turned and waved. Her face wore a look of bemused frustration. "You're leaving?" asked Curtis. "Aren't you needed for the meetings?" Iphigenia dismissively waved her hand in the air. "Bah," she said. "Who needs an old bag like me? I have no stomach for prolonged arguments. There are folks younger than I who can uphold our interests. However, I'm not going anywhere till this blasted axle is fixed." She eyed Prue. "I suppose you're going on your way, yes, half-breed?" "Yep," she said. "Going home. What about you? You heading back to Northwood?"
"Yes," replied the elder mystic. "I'll be making my way there eventually. The council tree will need attending. I imagine it will have a lot to say about our little adventure." "I think I might take my time heading home, though," she said. "While it was not under the best of circumstances, I did so enjoy seeing the Ancients' Grove again. I've not been there for many years. There are truly so many beautiful things to see in the wood. The great falls at the headwaters of Rocking Chair Creek, the outlook at the top of Cathedral Park. The very kind Crown Prince has invited me to stay with the avians for a time, a personal guest of the owl. I think I'd like that very much. Then, who knows, perhaps I'll find my way to the tree, visiting the tombs of my fallen predecessors, those ancient mystics who managed the journey before me. And then, a long, steaming hot bath and a cup of tea in the comfort of my own little home. That'll be enough adventuring for me."
"Best of luck," said Prue. "That sounds like a wonderful journey."
"Goodbye, Prue," said Iphigenia, holding out her arms.
Prue set the kickstand of her bike and walked into the elder mystic's embrace. Her wiry gray hair caressed Prue's cheek and was bathed in the rich scent of lavender. "I don't know if I'll ever see you again," Prue said, choking back tears. The mystic patted Prue's back.
"You will," she said. "You will."
Leaving the caravan wagon behind, Prue and Curtis continued on their way. When they arrived at the junction of the mansion's drive and the wide expanse of the long road, Curtis turned and extended his hand. "Okay, then," he said. "Let's not make this all blubbery and emotional. Goodbye, Prue." Prue stuck out her lower lip in mock seriousness. "Goodbye, Curtis. Coyote, soldier, bandit, revolutionary." They shook hands firmly. Curtis's chin began to quiver. Prue marked this by saying, "Oh, come on." She reached out her arms. Standing in the middle of the driveway, surrounded by a steady stream of traffic on the long road, the two friends shared a long hug. After a time, Curtis stepped back, wiping his nose with the cuff of his uniform. "Look what you did," he said. "My newly clean uniform all snotty on the cuff." He looked up at Prue, his eyes wet with tears. "See you, Prue." Without another word, Prue turned and walked her bike into the flow of traffic on the road. She gave Mac a quick kiss on the cheek and checked the connection between the bike and the wagon. All was well. Throwing one leg over the frame of the bike, she mounted the seat and set her feet on the pedals. Within a few moments, she was off. "Hey, Prue!" Curtis suddenly shouted. Prue pulled the handle brakes to slow the bike and turned around. If I ever need you, he called out over the hum of traffic, I'm gonna come find you, okay? Okay, responded Prue, moving farther down the road. Because we're partners, shouted Curtis. What was that? Yelled Prue. It was hard to make out words in the din of the busy road. We're partners, yelled Curtis at the top of his lungs. Prue grinned wildly, hearing him. Okay, she shouted, and the long road made a jog around the bend, and Curtis was gone behind her. She traveled for a time, weaving in and out of the knot of traffic before she arrived at the front gates. Seeing her coming, the guards threw open the doors and gave her a proud salute as she rode slowly under the arch of the wall. The long road stretched before her, leading off into the hazy distance. Standing up on the pedals, she kicked the bike into speed, the cool wind whipping at her cheek. Mac gurgled happily in the wagon and waved the carved horse above his head, as if it itself was riding wildly down the road. Let's go home, Mac, said Prue. Prue and Mac's reception, when they arrived back at their house in St. John's, was riotous. Her mother gripped her around the shoulders in a bone-crushing embrace, while her father whipped Mac, laughing, from the wagon and threw him deftly into the air. The exchange of hugs and kisses was so lengthy that they soon lost track of who had hugged whom, and which child had been kissed more. Even her parents spent several moments embracing each other as if they'd been the ones lost, while Prue looked on, bemused. The afternoon rolled into evening, and the celebration didn't cease. Prue's dad played DJ, pulling out all his favorite old rock-steady records, while her mother danced around the room, lost in a constant frenzy of indecision about which child should be her partner. In the end, she chose both, and the three of them spun around the house in a tight bunch, their arms clinging tightly to one another, faces bright red with joy. Prue's world, once again, returned to normal. Her absence from school during the week was explained away as a sudden extended illness, and her friends greeted her in the hallway with sympathetic faces. Chickenpox, Prue explained when pressed. One friend pointed out that she'd already had chickenpox, and that she remembered because she'd been the one who'd given them to Prue. Guess I got him again, Prue shrugged. The weeks passed. Halloween came and went, notable only for the fact that it was pouring rain that day, and everyone had to adjust their costumes accordingly. November ushered in an uncommon last bit of summer, the rains having abated, and the McKeel family chose a particularly pleasant Saturday to head out to one of the farms on Sovie's Island to pick some pumpkins for their planned Thanksgiving desserts. Prue milled around the apple orchard near the farm's open-air market while her parents went in, arguing over who had the best eye for squash. Mac, now walking unaided, tottered around the few picnic tables that dotted the orchard. A group of figures made their way towards the car in the parking lot that caught Prue's eye. They were a middle-aged couple, and their 2 children, both girls. Prue recognized them in an instant as the Melbergs, Curtis's family. Before she knew it, she was walking towards them. Mr. Melberg, she heard herself saying. Miss Melberg? The couple looked up. The 2 girls, one older, one younger than Prue, stared at her as she approached. Yes, said the woman. As Prue came closer, she saw such a sadness in the woman's face. Indeed, it was a sorrow that seemed to hover over the entire family like a dark cloud. Prue put her hand on Miss Melberg's arm. I was a friend of Curtis's, said Prue. The woman's face lit up. From school? What's your name? Prue McKeel. I knew him pretty well. Prue paused. I'm sorry for your loss. The pallor returned to the woman's face. Thank you, dear, she said. That's very kind. Prue bit her lower lip in thought. Finally, she said, I just want you to know that, well, I believe he's in a better place. I think wherever he is, he's happy. Truly happy. The Melbergs, the man and woman and their 2 daughters, stared at Prue for a moment before Mr. Melberg replied. Thank you, he said. We believe that too. It's very nice to meet you, Prue McKeel. He opened the driver's side door and climbed into his car. The rest of the family followed him. Only one of the girls, the youngest one, paused at the open car door and squinted up at Prue. Tell him hello, she requested before climbing into the back seat of the car. Prue, momentarily taken aback, replied, I will, and watched the car as it drove out of the parking lot and away down the road. The McKeel's trunk, when they arrived at home, was laden with squashes of every variety and size, and they'd had to make several trips to get the bounty into the kitchen. It was getting late. Mac, having had a bowl of banana and avocado at the farm, was acting fussy from tiredness. Prue's mom was flustered. Hey, can you put that cranky kid to bed? We've got to start these pies if they're going to be ready this week. Sure, said Prue, just now waking from the spell the encounter with the Melbergs had cast on her. She reached down and grabbed Mac, trundling into the kitchen for goodnight kisses from his parents. Once he'd been properly smothered in hugs, Prue took him upstairs, ignoring his tired whines, and put him in his jammies. She set him in the middle of his crib and snuggled his stuffed animal owl into his arms. She gave him a peck on the bald crown of his head and walked to the door, hitting the lights on the way out. Good night, Mackie, she said. She hadn't gotten halfway down the hallway when she heard her brother's mournful pleas. Pooh! Pooh! Stopping in her tracks, she sighed and rolled her eyes. Returning to the doorway of his room, she popped her head around the doorway. What's up? She asked. Mac gurgled something in response. Can't sleep? Not tired? What is it? Another gurgle. You want a story, don't you? She asked. Mac's face widened into a smile. Pooh! He chimed. Prue caved. Okay, she said, walking to his crib side and pulling him from the mattress. Just one story. The two of them, the brother and the sister, sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the room. Mac nestled himself against her arm, and Prue looked out the window, as if pulling the story from thin air. Finally, she began. Once upon a time, she said quietly, there lived a little boy and his big sister. But before that, there was a man and a woman, and they lived here in St. John's, and they wanted more than anything to have a family. But in order to have children, they had to make a deal with an evil queen who lived in a faraway wood. Mac was riveted, broad smile splayed across his face. The deal was that, in time, the evil queen would come for the second child, the little boy, and would take him with her into the forest kingdom. And one day she did. His sister, however, would have none of it, so she got on her bike and took off after him into the deep, dark woods. The end. If you enjoyed Wildwood, keep in mind that there are 2 more books in the series that you're welcome to check out and read at home, or have a family member read to you, or try and find on audiobook. The 3 actually go really nicely together, so if you enjoyed it, I would encourage you to try all 3. Bye, everybody. Thanks for reading the book with me.